Chapter 59. Shadow of the Crimson Spire. Jumping off the dead scavenger, Sonny retrieved his sword and whistled, letting Cassie know that it was safe to come out. Soon, she crawled out of a small opening in the coral wall and carefully put her feet on the ground. Leaning on her staff, the blind girl stood up and slightly turned her head, listening to the light sound of his footsteps. Sonny approached Cassie and took her hand, gently placing it on his shoulder. Then, carefully avoiding puddles of blood, he guided the blind girl to the echo. They talked on the way. Did those centipedes show up? During their journey through the labyrinth, they discovered that the scavengers were not the only creatures populating it. Different types of monsters lived in the Crimson Forest, hiding inside the reefs during the night and coming out to hunt once the sun was up. There were sentient colonies of carnivorous worms that attacked from beneath the black mud, flesh-eating flowers that strangled their prey with blood-sucking vines, and weird transparent tentacles that they had once seen dragging a desperately resisting scavenger into a dark, cavernous crevice. They still didn't know what type of creature had been hiding in the crevice. Sonny hoped that they would never find out. In short, the labyrinth was home to all kinds of horrors, every one of them at least of the awakened rank. They were all carrion eaters, living off the remains left behind by the monsters of the dark sea. Given the opportunity, they were also more than willing to devour each other, not to mention the 3 juicy humans. Luckily, the Carapace Legion turned out to be extremely territorial and seemed to have the upper hand in this region of the Crimson Reef. While their armor, size, and physical strength made the scavengers formidable opponents, dealing mostly with one type of creature was infinitely better than constantly facing unknown danger. The centipede monsters were the latest enemy of the Carapace Legion they had met. Some of these critters were more than 3 meters long, with glistening red chitin and hundreds of tiny, scurrying legs. They were abhorrently fast and agile, being able to move through mud, climb the coral walls, and even drop on the unsuspecting victims from above with incredible speed. What's worse, their bodies were able to secrete a corrosive black oil that melted through the strongest armor in seconds. The only redeeming quality of the centipede monsters was that their chitin shells weren't very tough and could be easily pierced by a sword. Sonny answered without turning back. Yeah, 6 of them, and a few scavengers too. We let them fight each other and then finished off the survivors. Cassie gulped. Were you hurt? Nothing our armor couldn't handle. What about the Centurion? He glanced at the half-devoured carcass and smiled. It's not going to bother us again. This was the second awakened monster they had slain after entering the dream realm. Compared to the first encounter, this battle went much smoother. No one died, no one was seriously injured. The Echo even kept both of its pincers. How many soul shards did we get? Sonny counted. Should be 11. Now it was Cassie's turn to smile. That's our biggest haul so far, by a lot. He nodded. Yeah. However, they had once again failed to receive a memory. Sonny wasn't sure if his bad luck was to blame, but neither he nor Nephi's had been able to acquire a single one for the past 2 weeks. It was almost as though the spell had decided that they had already gotten enough. There can never be enough. He sighed. One of the games he and Cassie liked to play during camp was to discuss what they would buy after coming back to the real world and becoming rich. However, he had to collect a few memories to auction off first. Otherwise, where would the money come from? Consumed by greed and avarice, Sonny approached the Echo and looked up at it with disapproval. Hey, you stop chewing. The scavenger obediently froze, a piece of meat still hanging from its mouth. Spit it out. Shaking his head, Sonny helped Cassie climb to her seat and handed her the reins. This weirdo actually gobbled up almost half of the Centurion. What's up with that? Of all the Echoes in the world, why did I have to get stuck with a defective one? His shadow solemnly nodded, expressing that it completely understood his sentiment. Sunny squinted at it. What a rare show of solidarity. The shadow didn't have any echoes, though. What defective individual was it stuck with? Cheeky bastard. Cassie laughed. Don't badmouth my steed. He is a great echo. I like him very much. It's a he now, huh? Sunny shook his head again and got to stripping the remaining meat off the centurion's carcass. Then, he placed the meat into the seaweed saddlebags attached to the scavenger. He had made these bags himself to increase the group's carrying capacity. After all, the scavenger was supposed to be extremely strong. Not using it to their advantage would have been an oversight. After that, Sunny sighed and got to the least pleasant task, harvesting the oil sacs from the centipede monster's corpses. Each had 2 of them, connected to a special gland. The whole process was more disgusting than dangerous, since the corrosive effect was only achieved after the liquids from the 2 sacs were mixed. They had not come up with a way to utilize the centipede oil yet, but Nephi's insisted on collecting as much of it as possible. She was sure that it was going to be of use one day. At the very least, the oil was highly flammable. Speaking of Nephi's, by the time Sunny was done collecting the sacks, she had already gathered all the soul shards and was standing in front of the echo. He showed her his trophies and carefully placed them in a separate saddlebag. All done. She nodded. Sunny looked at the sky, trying to determine the time. The sun was right above them, high in the gray sky. There was still plenty of daytime left. What do you think? We're right in between the flat hill and the bone ridge. Should we return or try to reach the ridge today? The ground level of the labyrinth was not uniform. Some parts of it were situated higher than the others. Currently, they were in one such area. The dark sea was much more shallow here, which meant that there were more natural features that remained above water during the night. That made for shorter distance between them. Nephi's thought for a bit, then said, "Let's push to the Bone Ridge." They had already scouted most of the way to it yesterday, so there wasn't much danger of getting lost in the labyrinth and not making it on time. With the carapace centurion dead, the unpredictable element that had been making their lives harder for these past few days was also gone. Considering this, changing Star's decision seemed proper. Sunny nodded. Okay. With that, he sent his shadow forward. Sometime later, they were approaching the Bone Ridge. The sun was preparing to set, but there was still enough time to get to safety. Sunny, however, felt alarmed and uncomfortable. This feeling began to pursue him soon after they had left the cliffs. It always appeared close to the evening and persisted until the last minutes of the sunset, then disappeared, leaving him puzzled and uneasy. The further west they traveled, the stronger the feeling became. It was as though something was not quite right with the world during that time. But no matter how hard Sunny tried to understand what that wrongness was, he couldn't. In the end, he decided to share his uneasiness with the group. After listening to him, the girls were surprised. It seemed that they did not notice anything strange. Even Cassie, whose affinity to revelations provided her with an incredible intuition, didn't experience the strange feeling. However, she did suggest a theory. Since Sunny was the only one susceptible to the feeling, it was logical to assume that there was something unique about him that made it possible. And the only difference he had from the girls in terms of perception was his shadow sense. Which meant that the source of the wrongness, most likely, had something to do with the behavior of shadows. Guided by her advice, Sunny was finally able to understand the reason for his discomfort. As it turns out, Cassie was right in the hours closest to sunset, when the sun was hanging low in the western skies. A vast shadow moved through the labyrinth, affecting his senses and making his skin crawl. The shadow was too distant and colossal to be seen, but he could still feel its presence. When he told Cassie about the immense shadow, she nodded, as though it explained everything. Then she said, That is the shadow of the Crimson Spire. Back then, it took him a couple of seconds to realize what she was talking about. The spire from your vision, the one with 7 seals. Cassie nodded. Yes, in my dream, it seemed to be as tall as a mountain. I could even see it from the walls of the human castle, looming in the distance like a crimson spear piercing the skies. When the sun sets, the spire's vast shadow falls over the castle and stretches east, as far as you can see. She was silent for a moment, then added, "The feeling I got when looking at the Crimson Spire was very similar to what you had described, only much more intense." Sunny frowned, trying to remember the exact words Cassie had used to describe her vision. 7 severed heads guarding 7 seals, a dying angel being devoured by hungry shadows, feeling of extreme terror and loss. What was the deal with that spire, exactly? Is it crimson because it's made out of the same stuff as the labyrinth? The crimson coral surrounding them was not, in fact, coral. It's just what they called it based on some resemblance, for the sake of simplicity. The actual nature of the strange material remained a mystery. Cassie hesitated. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the labyrinth is made from the same stuff as the spire. In other words, the Crimson Spire might have been the source of all this madness. Still, it was just a theory. There was too little information to confirm it. However, Sunny did feel that the spire was, in one way or another, at the center of all things that they had encountered. He just hoped that it wouldn't be their final destination. Knowing the reason behind his restlessness, Sunny was able to endure it much better. He even found a hidden benefit to this situation. As long as he sensed the shadow of the Crimson Spire, he could pinpoint the direction to the human castle, since it was situated somewhere between their location and the source of the shadow. In a sense, the Crimson Spire had become his inner compass. "Get ready." Neff's voice took Sunny out of his reverie. Shaking off the distracting thoughts, he focused on the task at hand. They were getting close to the Bone Ridge. This name came to their minds as soon as they had first laid their eyes on this towering landmark. It was visible from quite a distance, sharply contrasted against the crimson coral and the gray sky in all its ivory splendor. The Bone Ridge was, in fact, made of bone. The skeletal remains of a colossal sea monster lay on an enormous mound of chaotically growing coral, with its arching spine protruding especially high above the ground. It was impossible to say what the terrifying creature had looked like while it was still alive, but one thing was certain. It was gargantuan even by the standards of the Dark Sea. This wasn't the first giant skeleton they saw during their journey. In fact, the labyrinth was littered with remains of dead leviathans, their massive bones forming natural arches and palaces throughout it. They were easy to spot because the coral formations were especially tall and dense in their vicinity, as though trying to bury any sign of whiteness in the sea of crimson. Sunny, however, had a feeling that the situation was actually reversed. To him, it seemed as though the coral was actually growing out of the old bones and spreading in every direction, slowly consuming the world. When he looked at the crimson mounds surrounding the colossal remains, he couldn't help but see them as rivers of ancient, solidified blood. He was almost sure that if they were to dig deep enough into the black mud to find the roots of the crimson forest, they would find nothing but endless layers of bones. What a scary image. Regardless of what Sunny thought about the nature of the labyrinth, the beast whose remains formed the Bone Ridge was especially large. Thanks to that, a portion of its long spine was tall enough to remain above the water during the night. That's why they had chosen it as the next stop on their journey. With the evening approaching, the next task was crucial. They had to scale the dead Leviathan and make sure that no other creature had decided to take shelter in its remains. If something did, they had no choice but to try and kill it, since there was no time to retreat to their previous safe haven. The last step was often the riskiest. Coming to the base of the coral mound, the group moved around it, searching for a convenient path up. Eventually, they arrived in front of the creature's cracked, misshapen skull. With its lower jaw missing or buried under the mud, the upper formed a vast, cavernous cave. Feeling shivers running down his spine, Sonny passed beneath the terrifying palisade of teeth and entered the cave. With his shadow leading the way, they made way to the back of the creature's skull and soon entered the hollow expanse of its spine. Inside the spine, the bone surface under their feet was as wide as a road. Actually, it looked a lot like a highway running through a long tunnel, with stark beams of light falling through the gaps between the massive vertebrae. The tunnel was inclined upward, most of its length hidden behind the bend of the ceiling. When the echo entered the spine, its chitin legs produced a loud, echoing clatter. Nephi's grimaced. "Any movement?" Sonny checked with the shadow and shook his head. Changing Star looked forward and slightly lowered her chin. "Let's proceed." Despite the fact that the shadow had not noticed any danger, they still summoned their swords before moving forward. It was not their first time being ambushed at the edge of safety. Luckily, their precautions turned out to be unnecessary. Nothing was hiding inside the gargantuan remains, so they were able to reach the highest point of the spine without having to cut their way through an unknown number of monsters. By the time they got to safety, the sun was already setting. The dark sea was returning, filling the inside of the sea monster's spine with the echoing sound of rushing water. Sonny took the saddlebags off the echo and dismissed it, making their camp instantly feel much roomier. All three of them were in desperate need of a bath. Leaving the girls alone to give them an opportunity to wash themselves, Sonny walked some distance away and sat down, letting his tired body rest. His shadow returned to the lower parts of the spine, watching the black, dim water slowly rise and devour the ivory whiteness. He had to make sure that nothing would crawl out of the water at the last minute. With half of his mind preoccupied with observing the rising tide, the other half was free to wander. Sonny summoned the runes and checked the number of shadow fragments in his possession. Shadow fragments, 96/1000. Not bad, he only had 12 at the beginning of all this. In less than a month, the amount increased dramatically. He was stronger and faster now. He was also more experienced. However, that still left him far inferior to even the weakest nightmare creatures of the Forgotten Shore in terms of raw physical might, even with the help of the shadow. How long before I'm able to wrestle a scavenger with my bare hands? The answer was pretty obvious, not to mention extremely disappointing. Not before his own shadow core had awakened, which could only happen after returning to the real world. Sonny sighed. Soon it was his turn to wash. Taking the bottle of endless water from refreshed, rosy Cassie, he walked back to his secluded spot and dismissed the Pupitor's shroud. A cold breeze touched his pale skin, making Sonny shiver. He looked down, shaking his head at the amount of dirt, sweat, and dried blood that was covering his body. Being an awakened was not the cleanest of professions. While he was washing up, Nephis used the remaining time before nightfall to make a fire and cook some meat. These days, they even had salt to season it. At first, the idea of using the sea salt left behind by the dark sea did not seem very appealing, but after a while, they grew accustomed to it. Salt made every meal they had much tastier. They ate in silence, too hungry and tired to talk. Soon it was time to sleep. Sonny took the first watch, planning to fit in some sword practice before it was his turn to rest. Going through the motions of the basic kata, he split his mind in two. One part was concentrating on the movements of his body, while the other, smaller part, was observing the surface of the black water through his shadow. In the absence of wind, the dark circle covering the lower part of the spine was strangely calm. This was his first time seeing the black water without the constant undulation of waves, with its surface strangely flat and absolutely still. It looked like a giant mirror, one that was made of pure darkness. It was unnaturally mesmerizing. Suddenly, he felt a strong desire to come closer and take a look at his reflection. However, Sonny didn't move. He was terrified of what might look back. In the morning, Sonny woke up feeling grim and uneasy. The memory of the frightening dark mirror was still fresh in his mind, making every shadow seem sinister and foreboding. He scowled sullenly. What the hell? I'm the child of shadows. Why do I have to be afraid of my own domain? But then again, darkness and shadow were not the same, even if a lot of people tended to mistake one for another. Shadows were born from the absence of light. In a sense, they were manifestations of emptiness. True darkness, on the other hand, true darkness was its own entity. In a sense, shadows shared more in common with light than they did with darkness. I guess they do they? Philosophical debates with his internal monologue were not the best way to start the day, at least as far as Sonny was concerned. His already sour mood only got worse. With a short sigh, he sat up and stretched his arms, yawning. "Good morning." The sound of his voice was almost drowned by the echoing noise of rushing water. With the sun rising, the dark sea was in a hurry to retreat. Sonny was finally able to relax a little. Morning. Nephi's had been guarding the camp during the latter part of the night, so she was already awake. As usual, she was meditating with her eyes closed in the absolute darkness of the night. Watching over something actually meant listening for suspicious sounds, so keeping one's eyes open was not that useful. For everyone except Sonny, that is, who had perfect night vision thanks to his attributes. Hearing him stand up, Changing Star slowly opened her eyes. A soft afterglow left behind by the dancing white flame could still be seen in their depth, quickly disappearing as her sight adjusted to the twilight of dawn. She looked at Sonny and offered him a polite smile. In the past 2 weeks, Nephi's had also been training, perhaps even more diligently than him. However, she wasn't trying to improve her swordsmanship. She was actually trying to learn how to behave like a normal human. As the result, their interactions had become slightly less awkward for the most part. Sonny was able to recognize Changing Star's efforts because they were very similar to a phase he himself had gone through many years ago. On several occasions, he had caught her intently observing how Cassie talked and behaved around them. Sometime later, Neph would randomly try to mimic small details of her friend's behavior. The results were a mixed bag, to say the least. The first time she tried to greet him with a smile in the morning, Sonny panicked and almost summoned the Azure Blade. However, Nephi's was very smart and persistent. Today, her polite smile looked almost natural. He had no idea why Changing Star decided to work on her social skills. Of all things, during their perilous journey through the monster-infested hellscape that was the Forgotten Shore. But he didn't mind. It was actually rather entertaining to watch. Watching her torture herself every day, enduring terrible pain in hopes of learning to better control her aspect ability, on the contrary, was not fun at all. They never talked about it, but Sonny knew that every time Nephi's pretended to meditate, she was actually subjecting herself to the excruciating agony of her flaw. When he thought about it, his heart ached. Sonny wasn't used to feeling such things, but he suspected that this was what other people called compassion. At least it was similar to how it was described in books and dramas. Not that he knew a lot about that stuff. After they had breakfast, Nephi stood up and looked at the beam of light falling through the nearest gap between giant vertebrae. Turning to Sonny, she said, "Let's study the surroundings." They needed to get the lay of the land and decide on their next step. Usually, that implied looking for the nearest natural features that were high enough to stay above the surface of the sea and deciding on which one they would try to reach next. Then came a day or two of scouting and hunting, followed by moving the camp to that feature. Sonny gave her a nod. "All right." He summoned the echo to guard Cassie while they were away and left the shadow behind to keep an eye out, just in case something happens. Then Sunny followed Nephi's to the gap. Boosting her, he watched as Changing Star flew through the air and then seemingly ran up the wall, kicking herself off at the last moment and propelling her body even higher before grabbing onto a bone protrusion. Relying only on her upper body strength, she then climbed up and disappeared into the cascading light. Soon, the golden rope fell down, allowing him to follow. Nephi's helped him climb atop the gargantuan spine and then straightened, turning to take a look west. Sunny shook his hands and did the same, expecting to see the usual picture, an endless expanse of the crimson labyrinth, dotted here and there with rare high points. However, what they saw left them both speechless. Some distance away, the labyrinth seemed to lose color. The crimson blades of coral stood gray and misshapen, as though struck by some unknown disease and drained of all life. The stone-like material looked brittle and fragile, ready to crumble to dust at any moment. The patch of dead coral spread for as far as the eye could see. Further away, the walls of the labyrinth seemed to have collapsed into a sea of ash-gray sand. This ashen wasteland looked so alien and strange after weeks of seeing only the endless crimson pathways that Sunny felt a shiver run down his spine. The fact that they didn't notice even a single monster moving through the mud beneath made him feel even more disturbed. There was only one visible high point to the west of them. Far away into the distance, the ground rose, forming a tall hill. The hill was probably the largest they had seen, easily capable of becoming a real island once the water rose in the night. Its shape reminded Sunny of a colossal barrow. Covered in the gray sand left behind by dead coral, the hill resembled a mountain of ash. That mountain was crowned by a giant tree. The tree rose into the sky like a tower, its branches wide enough to cover the whole island in their shade. The bark of the giant tree was as black as the water of the dark sea, while its leaves were red as blood. Contrasted against the gray sky, the crimson crown of the majestic tree looked incredibly vibrant and magnificent. Sunny gulped. "What the hell is that?" Nephi's was either thinking or had nothing to say. She just stared into the distance, a slight frown on her face. At that moment, something glistened brightly from beneath the tree. The glimmer was clear and easily visible even from their position, like a beam of sunlight reflected by a large mirror. A moment later it was gone, only to appear again after a few seconds. A mirror. Sunny shivered, remembering the previous night. For some reason, the bright glimmer suddenly seemed to become menacing. After some time had passed, he addressed Neph again. "What do you think?" She lingered a bit before turning to him. While Changing Star was deliberating on what to say, he glanced at the ashen wasteland again. Finally, she spoke. "This is the only way west." Sunny grimaced and looked away. He didn't like this turn of events one bit. "So we are going." Nephi's turned to face the giant tree, and as though affected by its grandeur, hesitantly shrugged. "Do we have a choice?" Some time later, they abandoned the remains of the giant sea monster and moved west, planning to check the situation inside the wasteland that lay between them and the Ashen Barrow. Initially, they weren't planning to approach the strange island. However, things turned out to be rather unusual once they entered the wasteland. With gray sand under their feet and dead coral walls surrounding them, the group was fully prepared to face unknown danger. Despite the fact that they had not seen any monster moving through this area from the top of the Leviathan's spine, neither Sunny nor Nephi's truly believed that no one was going to attack them in this strange region of the labyrinth. There were too many ways for the nightmare creatures to hide themselves, and if there was one thing the sleepers had learned during their time on the Forgotten Shore, it was that everything here was either deadly or concealing something capable of killing them. In that regard, their first encounter with the carnivorous worms was especially traumatic. However, their common sense turned out to be wrong this time around. The wasteland was quiet and empty, completely void of any signs of life. The absence of monsters was, in theory, supposed to make Sonny feel better, but he felt even more nervous than usual instead. This whole situation reeked of danger. It was strange and unnatural. If even the monsters were afraid to approach this place, what were they doing walking deeper and deeper into the wasteland of their own free will? Were they fools not to turn around and run away immediately? Soon they reached the point where the walls of the labyrinth had crumbled into dust. Now, there was nothing but a vast expanse of gray sand between them and the hill crowned by the giant tree. Nothing could hide on that ashen flat. However, they would also be unable to conceal themselves from anyone's gaze. Sonny glanced at Nephi's. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Changing Star scowled and lowered her chin. Then, looking forward, she scowled and said, "Let's go." As soon as they left the familiar confines of the labyrinth and stepped into the vast expanse of the ashen wasteland, Sonny felt strangely uncomfortable. It was as though he had unknowingly turned slightly agoraphobic while traveling through the complicated madness of the Crimson Maze. He had grown accustomed to being surrounded by tall walls of coral, with endless tangled paths stretching in all directions for as far as he could see. Despite the fact that the labyrinth was hiding numerous dangers, it also offered a strange sort of safety. At least in the case of Sonny, who had the advantage of being able to see beyond its twists and turns thanks to his stealthy shadow scout. Now, with gray sand beneath and nothing to break the line of sight, he had lost that advantage. The idea of not being able to hide from the enemy made him feel naked. "Keep cool, there's no one here." That thought, which was supposed to calm him down, had the opposite effect instead. Indeed, there were no nightmare creatures anywhere in the desolate wasteland, but why was that? What made them so eager to avoid this place? Nephi's was walking in the front of the group, with Sonny right behind her. The Echo was in the rear, moving at a slow pace. He looked around and, after a bit of hesitation, said in a low voice, "I don't like this." Nephi's glanced at him with her usual indifferent expression. Turning away, she simply said, "Stay alert." They continued forward in silence, sand squeaking under their feet. A dozen or so minutes later, Changing Star raised her hand, gesturing them to stop. Turning to Sonny, she asked, "Has your shadow noticed anything?" He shook his head. "No, there are some irregularities here and there, like small knolls or shallow pits, but nothing is moving. Mostly it just seems flat and lifeless." He turned to Cassie and asked hesitantly, "Do you hear anything?" In some cases, her keen hearing was more effective than his shadow sense. When they were caught by the storm, Cassie had been able to sense that something was wrong long before her seeing companions noticed anything. However, this time it was of no use. She simply shook her head, indicating that there were no unusual sounds around them. Nephi sighed and lowered her head, thinking. Then she cast a gaze at the distant ashen barrow. "Let's continue." However, she did change the direction of the group slightly, aiming to approach one of the knolls that Sonny had noticed. By the time they approached it, it was already noon. The sun was right above their heads, making their shadows small and shapeless. Sonny's own shadow had returned and was now hiding beneath his feet, looking like a formless blob of darkness. This time of day was its least favorite. Nephi summoned her sword and slowly approached the knoll, trying to determine its nature. There was nothing remarkable about it except for the fact that everything around was flat, and it was not. The knoll was about as tall as Sonny, somewhat oblong and covered in the same gray sand as the rest of the wasteland. It didn't seem dangerous, but there was no harm in checking. Well, most likely. Maybe it could provide them with some useful information. Just as Changing Star was about to stretch her hand and touch the surface of the knoll, Sonny's shadow suddenly noticed something moving in the distance, back at the edges of the labyrinth where they had come from. Acting on instinct, Sunny jumped toward the echo and hissed to Neff, "Hide!" At the same time, he dismissed the hulking scavenger. Suddenly losing her mount, Cassie flung her hands up and fell. Catching her in the Princess Carry, Sunny darted toward the knoll and lowered himself to the ground, placing the blind girl between himself and crouching Nephis. Changing Star put one hand on Cassie's shoulder and looked at him with a silent question in her eyes. "Danger!" Sunny raised one hand with his palm open, telling her to wait. His shadow was already peeking from behind the knoll, carefully observing the source of the movement. Already some distance away, the dead walls of the labyrinth rose from the gray sand. Suddenly, one of them collapsed, knocked over by a massive figure. Surrounded by the cloud of ashen sand, the figure moved forward, stepping onto the flat surface of the wasteland. 8 legs, 2 terrifying bone scythes, black and crimson carapace that looked like ancient armor that had been splattered with blood. Another centurion. Sunny silently cursed. They fought these monsters twice before, and won both times. However, that was because each battlefield had been carefully prepared to stack advantages in their favor, with plenty of planning and devious scheming on their part. He wasn't sure that they would be able to kill one in a direct confrontation, at least not without suffering serious damage. Turning to Nephis, Sunny whispered. A carapace centurion had just walked out of the labyrinth. She scowled. Cassie, meanwhile, lightly touched his hand and asked, "Where is it heading?" Sunny blinked, then concentrated on the shadow's vision. Soon he exhaled with some relief. "Looks like it's heading for the Ashen Barrow. If we stay hidden behind this knoll and it doesn't change course, there's a high chance that it won't notice us." Changing Star thought for a second and then nodded. "Keep an eye on it and tell me as soon as something changes." Trying to become as small and silent as possible, the 3 of them pressed their bodies to the knoll. There wasn't a lot of space to hide, so they had to endure being cramped against each other. Well, maybe endure was not the right word. Sunny might have even enjoyed the situation in other circumstances. "What are you thinking about, fool? Concentrate on the deadly monster," he thought angrily, berating himself. But it was so hard to concentrate with Cassie's soft body pressed against his. Deadly monster. Finally able to get his mind out of the gutter, Sunny sighed and focused on observing the centurion. The hulking creature was moving through the wasteland, slowly drawing closer. Soon, he was able to see every crimson line and every spike on its weathered carapace. However, his eyes were glued to something else. Cautiously held between the centurion's scythes, a beautiful crystal was gleaming with hypnotic inner light. It was bright and strangely alluring. A transcendent soul shard. They had already seen a similar scene, back when a pair of centurions were retrieving 2 of such crystals from the remains of the giant shark-like creature. So that was their destination. Sunny glanced at the magnificent tree standing atop the Ashen Barrow. With its onyx branches and vibrant scarlet leaves, it looked striking and majestic, like something wholly hidden in the depths of hell. He shared his findings with the group, careful to keep his whisper as quiet as possible. The centurion was about to walk past their hiding spot. Despite the fact that there was some distance between its path and the knoll, Sunny was still nervous. This was the most dangerous moment. The monster came level with the knoll, then proceeded forward without blinking an eye. He exhaled. "It's walking toward the barrow." Nephis did not relax, still ready for things to go south at any moment. "Follow it." Sunny nodded. A moment later, his shadow slid from behind the knoll, sneakily pursuing the nightmare creature. With how much the range of shadow control had improved, he was pretty sure of his ability to tail it to the footsteps of the Ashen Hill. The centurion crossed the wasteland with the transcended shard clasped tightly between its sides. Its bearing was somewhat strange, seeming almost pious. It looked like a pilgrim walking toward a mysterious, sacred site. Soon it approached the ashen barrow and suddenly stopped, as though afraid to cross some invisible line. Then the centurion carefully placed the shard on the sand and backed away from it, its eyes turned to the ground. After distancing itself from the gleaming crystal, the massive creature kneeled. Sonny had to rub his eye to make sure that he wasn't seeing things. He wasn't. The carapace centurion bent its 8 legs and lowered itself to the ground, submissively placing its terrifying scythes in front of its bowing torso. Noticing Sonny's strange behavior, Nephi's raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" He hesitated. "Wait." At this moment, his shadow, which was safely hidden some distance away from the kneeling monster, noticed a slight change on the surface of the ashen barrow. The bright glimmer they had seen from the top of the Leviathan's spine was back. Only this time, it was even more blinding. The glimmer rose into the air from the shadows cast by the branches of the towering tree and moved, slowly approaching the footsteps of the hill. When Sonny was finally able to discern the source of the shining, his eyes widened. Feeling a cold shiver running down his spine, he forgot to breathe. Moving through the ashen sand and piles of fallen leaves, a giant monster was coming down the hill. Sonny gulped, his expression turning dark. The creature was as large as a house, with its 8 segmented legs resembling tall pillars. Its form was similar to that of scavengers and centurions, comprised of a crab-like carapace and a protruding, somewhat humanoid torso. However, this was where the similarities between them ended. Instead of chitin, the behemoth's shell was seemingly made out of polished, lustrous metal. It was as though its whole body had been once submerged into a crucible of molten steel, emerging from it encased in an impenetrable suit of shining armor. Beams of sunlight were reflecting from the chrome surface of the carapace, creating the bright glimmer Sonny had noticed. Massive but strangely elegant, the steel monster resembled a giant knight. Sonny was ready to swear that he had noticed the shapes of 7 stars carved into its chest. However, that knight was corrupted and evil. It radiated a sinister aura, like a demon summoned from hell to sow death and slaughter. The polished armor of the creature was covered with long, jagged spikes. Its humanoid torso had 4 mighty arms, 2 ending with powerful pincers, the other 2 with razor-sharp, terrifying scythes. The demon's head was more pronounced than that of a scavenger and crowned with several tall, sharp horns. Its metal face was almost human-like, but simultaneously repulsively monstrous and bestial. Just looking at it made Sonny's skin crawl. That thing is scary. Whatever that creature was, its rank within the Carapace Legion was clearly higher than that of a centurion, not to mention of a lowly scavenger. It was the next step in their evolution. A general or a commander, perhaps. What were they called? Legates, praetorians. Holding his breath, Sonny watched as the Carapace demon descended from the ashen barrow. Stopping in front of the transcendent soul shard, it looked briefly at the kneeling centurion. The deadly awakened monster shrank under its gaze, as if terrified of the larger nightmare creature. Sonny knew how it felt, since he did the same when the behemoth's eyes had briefly glided past his shadow's hiding place. Not paying the centurion any attention, the Carapace demon picked up the gleaming crystal and turned around. Then, it unhurriedly returned to the shade of the giant tree's branches. Sonny slowly exhaled. "Sonny, what is happening?" He looked at Cassie, whose face was full of worry and curiosity. After hesitating for a little while, he said, "There's a new threat. Stay quiet a bit longer, I'll explain later." Back at the footsteps of the tall hill, the Carapace centurion was finally ready to stand up again. Sonny was in a dilemma. He had to follow the monster to make sure that it doesn't stumble on their hiding place on its way back to the labyrinth. However, he was also extremely curious to see what the carapace demon was up to in its lair on the top of the ashen barrow. There was no time to think things through properly. Making a hasty decision, Sonny sent his shadow sliding over the gray sand. It masterfully avoided the carapace centurion's eyes and was already climbing the tall hill a few seconds later. One look, I'll just take one look. Hiding in the deep shade cast by the majestic tree's scarlet crown, the shadow glided up the slope and approached the place where the carapace demon had disappeared from its sight. On top of the hill, the ground was covered with fallen leaves. The ashen barrow was indeed larger than any high natural feature they had encountered before, vast and spacious as an actual island. However, the traces left behind by the massive creature's pillar-like legs could be easily seen. They led the shadow to the center of the island, where the obsidian tree's enormous trunk was rising from the ground, with its broad roots stretching in all directions. The carapace demon was standing beneath the tree, looking up at its lower branches. The transcendent shard was still clenched in its pincer. What is it looking at? Sonny made the shadow trace the creature's gaze and noticed several round, appetizing fruits hanging between the scarlet leaves. One of them looked especially ripe. Suddenly, the demon dropped the soul shard into the sand and, completely forgetting about it, raised its body. It stretched a pincer up and gently grasped the fruit, then pulled on it. Without any resistance, the fruit tore off the branch. Holding it as something fragile and extremely precious, the massive creature slowly lowered itself to the ground. Then, it carefully brought the fruit to its mouth and took a small bite. It's eating fruits. This abomination is vegetarian. Bewildered and not quite sure of what he had just seen, Sonny had no choice but to command his shadow to leave and hurry to the base of the hill. The time was up, and if he wanted to catch up with the carapace centurion, he had to act with haste. Gliding over the fallen leaves, the shadow descended from the ashen barrow and flew back in the direction of the labyrinth, soon catching up with the retreating monster. Phew! Feeling a lot of relief, Sonny made sure that the centurion's route would not put him on the collision course with the knoll they had been hiding behind, and finally allowed himself to relax. Slightly. He waited until the scythe-wielding monster was completely gone, before slowly rising back to his feet. It's safe to come out now. Nephi's and Cassie stood up, stretching and massaging their limbs. Suddenly remembering how tightly they were pressed against each other while hiding behind the knoll, Sonny just barely avoided turning red with embarrassment. That was a necessary measure. He was almost glad that the carapace demon had appeared at the perfect moment to take his thought away from that situation. What happened? Nephi's looked at him and raised an eyebrow. For once, her expression of indifference did not look very convincing. Sonny glanced at the not-so-distant ashen barrow and shivered. There's danger ahead. We need to return to the Bone Ridge. I'll explain everything once we're safe and sound back at the camp. She opened her mouth to say something, but then thought better of it and remained silent, simply giving him a nod. The trust they had built was enough for that much at least. Sonny summoned the echo, tied the golden rope around its torso, placed Cassie's makeshift saddle back on its carapace, and helped the blind girl climb to her seat. Picking up the saddlebags, he fixed them back onto the scavenger and took a step away. They were ready to go. Before that, however, Sonny had one more thing to do. Coming close to the knoll, he used his hands to brush the sand off its surface. Soon, the onyx-black surface was revealed beneath. It was the same exact color as the bark of the colossal tree growing from the center of the ashen barrow. The knoll was, in fact, just a small portion of one of the tree's giant roots, raised slightly above the ground in this part of the wasteland. Sonny looked around, trying to calculate the size of this sea of ash. Finally, he was starting to understand what had drained all life from the giant patch of the Crimson Labyrinth. Back inside the bone ridge, they were sitting around the fire. The delicious smell of roasting meat filled the air, making Sonny's stomach produce embarrassing sounds. However, it wasn't time to eat yet. He was in the middle of telling the girls about what he had seen. After the centurion kneeled, another carapace creature came from the top of the ashen barrow. Only this one was not one of those we had seen before. It was easily twice the size of the centurion, 6 or 7 meters tall. I can't even imagine how much it weighs. It looked like a moving house. Nephi's frowned, clearly not happy to know that there was such a behemoth barring their way. What's more, its carapace is not made of chitin. Instead, it looks like some strange metal alloy. I don't think we'll be able to cut through it. I also didn't notice any gaps in that monstrosity's armor, not even around the joints. Cassie gulped, turning her head to her friend. Changing Star, however, remained silent. Sunny sighed. In addition, that thing has 4 arms instead of the usual 2, a pair with pincers and a pair with scythes. They're even bigger than the centurion's. Its carapace is littered with spikes and it has long horns on its head. It also looks more human-like. It almost got a face, albeit an extremely ugly one. And its eyes, well, I think that it is more sentient than anything we had faced before. Nephi's was thoughtful. After a while she said, "It is probably an awakened demon." Nightmare creatures with 1 soul core were called beasts. The ones with 2 cores were called monsters. 3 cores belonged to a class of creatures known as demons, with devils right above them with 4 cores. Sunny gave her a nod, indicating that he was in agreement with her conclusion. Or maybe a devil. In any case, I think we should avoid that scary bastard at all cost. Changing Star stared at him, tilting her head a little. For a minute or so, there was only silence. Sunny gritted his teeth, then sighed, then blinked a couple of times. Finally, he gave her a doomed, crooked smile. "Let me guess, you want to kill it. Me guess, you want to kill it." Nephi's continued to stare at him with her usual unreadable expression. After a while, Sunny chuckled and shook his head in disbelief. "You really are crazy. That's an awakened demon we're talking about, remember. Have you forgotten that we're just sleepers?" Then he frowned and scratched his head. Wait a second. I feel like we already had this conversation before. Doesn't it feel familiar? Cassie turned to face the two of them and politely cleared her throat. "Actually, you had said pretty much the exact same thing right before we decided to attack that first carapace centurion." Sunny beamed. "Yes, exactly. And how did that end up? I almost got killed." Nephi shrugged indifferently. "You survived, didn't you?" He froze with his mouth open, too flabbergasted by the sheer audacity of her remark to answer immediately. A few seconds later, Sunny was finally able to speak again. "That's not the point." Cassie gently touched her friend on the shoulder and whispered, "Neph, that's not a very nice thing to say." Changing Star's face flushed a little. Glancing aside, she hesitated and said, "What I meant to say is, we've won in the end, didn't we? It was a risk we had to take and it paid off. We've grown stronger since then." Sunny had a feeling that the fight against the carapace demon was already inevitable, but couldn't bring himself to stop protesting, solely out of principle. "But that thing, it's huge. It's so tall you won't even be able to poke it with your sword. What are we going to do?" asked the bastard politely to lower itself to our level. Neff frowned and looked at him with displeasure. "It's just an awakened demon, I know." Sunny sighed and shook his head again, feeling like he was talking to a stone wall. Changing Star's mind was still a mystery to him. He had realized a long time ago that there was a deep dark well hidden behind her seemingly radiant exterior. No one pushed themselves that hard, endured that much, went that far unless they were being pursued by demons of their own. He knew that from experience. And judging by how far ahead of everyone he had ever known Nephi's was, her personal demons were especially dreadful. much more dreadful than the terrifying carapace demon, at least. But although Sonny understood that she was running from something, he had no idea what destination she was so desperate to reach. Just why was she so hell-bent on finding that damned human castle, even more so than Sonny himself? His burning desire to come back to reality and rip all the rewards that the world owed him was so intense that it would frighten most people to death. There were very few things that he wasn't willing to do to achieve his dream. However, it only had meaning for as long as he stayed alive. Nephi's, on the other hand, seemed to pursue a goal that held more meaning than her life. Why else would she be so willing to risk it? Sonny just couldn't understand that logic. It was irrational and paradoxical. What can be more important than your life? If you die, you won't be able to enjoy the fruits of your labor anyway. He looked Nephi's in the eyes and said, "Back when we agreed to fight the Carapace Centurion, we did so because there was no other choice. We were literally stuck on a rock with it. What about now? Don't we have a choice to avoid the Ashen Barrow?" She stared at him for a while and then simply said, "That's the only way west." Sonny laughed. "That is the truth, I'll give you that." When his laughter died down, he wiped the corner of his eye and said, all right, that makes sense. But believe me when I say it, as the only one who actually saw the Carapace demon, we won't be able to defeat it in a fight." Nephi scowled. "Your point?" Sonny spread his hands. "Don't misunderstand. Yes, we can't defeat it, but—" A dark smile appeared on his face. "That doesn't mean that we can't kill it." Changing Star thought about it, then raised an eyebrow and asked, "You have a plan?" Sonny shook his head. "Not yet, not entirely. Let me sleep on it. However, there's one thing I know for sure." He looked west, remembering the Carapace demon's disturbing, bestial face. In the ensuing silence, Cassie turned her head to face him and asked with curiosity, "What is it?" Sonny blinked. Oh yes. It's pretty simple, really. Unlike the scavengers and centurions, that thing appears to be rather intelligent, which means that it can be deceived. They spent another uneventful night inside the dead Leviathan's spine. As far as their camps went, this one was probably the safest. There was a certain comfort in being surrounded by walls from all sides, even if they were made out of bone. Sleeping on top of cliffs and coral mounds, just meters away from the surface of the dark sea, exposed to elements, was not very restful. Sonny even entertained the thought of suggesting to Nephi's that they should stay here for a while, a few weeks, or even months if needed. They could slowly explore the surrounding areas, hunt monsters, and grow stronger. Then, after absorbing hundreds of soul shards and shadow fragments, armed with dozens of memories, and even a few more echoes, perhaps, they could attack the Carapace demon and be more sure of success. However, he quickly realized that it was a bad idea. The Forgotten Shore was perilous and unpredictable. They were rather successful in conquering its dangers so far, but it was too easy for the situation to change. One moment of bad luck was enough to doom them. One wrong turn, one unfortunate encounter, one more enemy than they were able to handle, and their lives would be over. And that was only in regard to the usual menagerie of abominable horrors they had to fight on the daily basis. The labyrinth hid much more terrifying secrets and existences, not to mention the unimaginable terrors of the deep dark sea. Every additional day they spent here gave a chance for something fatal and unavoidable to happen. Their best hope of survival was to face the Carapace demon as soon as possible. Maybe after defeating it, they would finally be able to see the tall walls of the promised castle. Sonny tossed and turned the whole night, thinking about the giant creature and trying to give shape to the nascent seed of the idea of how to kill it. Close to the morning, he was finally able to fall asleep, only to be awakened by Cassie carefully shaking his shoulder half an hour later. Sonny blinked, looking at the blind girl in confusion. "What is it?" She gestured to Nephi's, asking her to come closer. Then, a little pale, she gathered her courage and said, "I had another vision. A vision about the carapace demon." Sonny was instantly wide awake. Sitting up, he hurriedly rubbed his eyes and then glanced at the blind girl, ready to listen. Nephi's approached them and sat down, her face barely visible in the dim light of the early dawn. "Past or future?" Sonny blinked. "Right, I should have asked myself." Cassie thought for a bit, and then hesitantly answered, "Past, I think." After a short pause, her expression changed to that of certainty. "No, I'm sure of it." Changing Star slightly tilted her head. "That's good, so what did you see?" Cassie deeply inhaled and fell silent for several seconds, remembering. Her face paled a little, but this time she was ready to face her fear. "I saw the ashen barrow deep at night, enveloped in a raging storm. The winds were bending the branches of the great tree, as if desperate to break them. The island was illuminated by the constant barrage of thundering lightning bolts, with rain falling from the skies like a flood." She paused, catching her breath, and continued. "The carapace demon was there, standing in the middle of the storm like an unshakable fortress made of polished steel. Arcs of electricity were dancing between the spikes on his armor, but the demon did not pay it any attention. He was just as Sonny described, prideful, sinister, and terrifying." Cassie closed her eyes. "When I looked into his eyes, I felt a sense of emptiness and corruption. He observed the storm until it began to dissipate. The winds weakened, the rain stopped. The great tree stood unbroken, just as magnificent as it was before. But then the last bolt of lightning fell from the sky and struck the ground beside it." Sonny was listening to her tale with great attention, hopeful to hear a piece of useful information. "So that monstrosity is not afraid of lightning. Shame. With its metal carapace, I was almost tempted to try and lure it from under the tree during a storm. Apparently, that wouldn't work." Meanwhile, Cassie was ready to carry on. "That bolt of lightning could never hurt the carapace demon, let alone the miraculous tree. However, when it hit the ground, it ignited the fallen leaves that cover the ashen barrow's surface. Soon, a large part of the island was engulfed in fire. In the absolute darkness of the night, it shone like a beacon." Sonny perked up, remembering something. Back when the three of them first met at the beginning of their deadly adventure through the dream realm, the girls mentioned that the light he had seen from the giant knight's statue a few nights prior was indeed made by them. However, making that fire had turned out to be a big mistake. At night, any source of light was like a lure for the monsters of the Forgotten Shore, including the terrifying creatures that lurked in the depths of the dark sea. That's why, ever since, they were careful to never light a fire after sunset, preferring to endure the darkness instead of attracting unknown horrors from beneath the waves. Having a guess of what had happened next in Cassie's vision, he waited for the blind girl to continue. Her voice trembled a little. "Before the flames died down, the dark sea surged, and a thing crawled out of it, covering almost the entire slope of the ashen barrow with its body. It looked like a mass of bones and rotten flesh connected by black seaweed, with thousands of horrible eyes staring at me hungrily from beneath, coiling tentacles seething as it pushed itself toward the great tree." Her face turned slightly green. Just remembering the abomination made Cassie feel nauseated, but she gritted her teeth and did not stop speaking. "That was the most repulsive creature I've ever seen. However, it seemed slow and clumsy, as though being ashore, outside of the black water, was weakening it. The carapace demon did not hesitate to lunge at the creature, completely ignoring the fact that it was at least 10 times his size. It was like he completely lost his mind, enraged by the intrusion on the island." Nephi suddenly spoke. "How did the demon survive?" The blind girl hesitated. I don't know. I didn't see the battle itself, only its beginning and its end. At the break of dawn, the carapace demon crawled back into the shade of the great tree. He was severely wounded, with several of his legs missing and his sides covered by a spiderweb of cracks. The fire was gone, and there was no sign of the sea creature anywhere in sight. She paused for a moment, and then said in a quiet voice, "The most terrible wound was on his chest. The steel armor of the demon was fractured and split apart, revealing the beating heart inside. Rivers of azure blood were flowing from the wound, mixing with the ashen sand. The demon crawled to the base of the tree and laid his broken body between its roots." Cassie sighed. "The last thing I saw was the passage of time. I don't know how long it took, but eventually the carapace demon was able to recover from his wounds. His scythes restored themselves, his legs grew back. The fracture on his chest was the last to heal. However, it wasn't healed completely. Hidden from sight, there's still a weakness in his armor." Both Sunny and Nephi's were silent for a long time, thinking. Changing Star was the first to break the silence. "So it's not impenetrable after all." Then she looked at Sunny and asked, "How's your plan coming along?" He blinked, extricating himself from the swarm of thoughts. Glancing at his companions, Sunny smiled. "Pretty well. I already had an inkling of how we should proceed, but Cassie's vision gave me additional inspiration." Nephi's raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" He gave her a confident nod. "Yeah, it's a wild idea, but it might just work. Well, maybe. In any case, it's going to be risky, and we'll have to make some preparations." Both Cassie and Nephi's looked at him expectantly. The blind girl cautiously asked, "So, what's your plan? How are we going to deceive the demon?" Sunny crossed his arms. "It's not very complicated. Actually, I got the idea from that ancient fellow Neph likes to talk about. We're going to build." He took a dramatic pause, and then said with a mysterious smile, "A Trojan ass." However, their reaction was not what he had expected. Both girls blinked, then stared at him with complicated expressions. Well, Cassie did not stare since she was blind, but her face was exactly the same as Changing Star's. "Strange. So what now?" Sunny scratched the back of his head, somewhat embarrassed, and cleared his throat. Did I use the wrong word? I thought that Odysseus guy built a wooden animal, a donkey." Nephi's raised a hand and put it on her forehead, closing her eyes. "Weird, does she have a headache?" Are you all right?" She sighed deeply, then said in a flat tone, "A horse, it was a horse." The next day, they returned to the place of the battle between the Carapace Legion and the Centipede monsters. A few days earlier, they had lured a Carapace Centurion here to ambush it, but ended up causing a massive confrontation between the two tribes of nightmare creatures. The carcasses of some of the monsters were still there, buried slightly in the mud. Of course, there was no meat left on their skeletons. The inhabitants of the labyrinth were for the most part carrion eaters after all. However, the three sleepers were not interested in meat. They came for something else. Stopping in front of the Centurion's empty shell, cleaned of any flesh by some unknown beasts, he looked at the black and crimson carapace in satisfaction. Nephi's walked over and stood by his side, an unreadable expression on her face. "Is this what you wanted?" Sunny smiled. "Yeah, exactly. I knew that nothing would be insane enough to chew on the chitin, but in this place, you never know. I wasn't sure about its condition." But the condition was good. In fact, it was perfect. Close to the evening, with the sun tiredly descending toward the horizon, a strange creature walked out of the colorless remains of the labyrinth. If walking was even the right word. Dragging its legs in the sand, the creature somehow floated forward without moving them. It looked like a carapace centurion, or at least a close approximation of one. All the necessary parts were in place. The creature had a black carapace with a menacing crimson pattern on it, a humanoid torso, 8 segmented legs and 2 arms ending with formidable bone scythes. However, all these parts looked mismatched and strange, as though put together by some clumsy sculptor. Additionally, the Centaurian moved as if it was seriously drunk. The carapace was careening to one side, sometimes scraping against the sand. The torso was swinging back and forth for no apparent reason. The scythes were awkwardly lodged behind the creature's back, crossed against each other at a strange angle. At some point, one of them simply dropped to the ground. The Centaurian stopped and hesitated for a few seconds, as though unsure what to do. Then it left its scythe arm behind and continued on its way as if nothing had happened. A perceptive observer would have noticed that the creature seemed to possess two shadows. The first shadow was, as one would expect, its shape identical to the creature itself. The second one resembled a human. It briefly showed itself from beneath the larger shadow when the Centaurian abandoned the runaway limb. The human shadow then proceeded to facepalm and shake its head in utter contempt. The whole situation was nothing short of being completely bizarre. But, for better or worse, there was nobody around to notice the weird creature. Unobstructed, it traversed the wasteland, moving in the direction of the ashen barrow. Soon, it was almost at the footstep of the tall hill. The sunset was approaching. The strange Centaurian plopped on the ground at the base of the ashen barrow and stopped moving completely, awkward and lopsided. It looked like a parody of the other monster of its kind, who had kneeled gracefully at the same spot a few days prior. Additionally, it arrived without a tribute. There was no transcendent soul shard in sight. Added to the disrespectful pose, this transgression was more than enough to get the Centaurian killed. Perhaps it was suicidal. On top of the barrow, the carapace demon moved and rose from the ashen sand. His shining armor glistened, reflecting the light of the setting sun. Encased in bright metal, with a crown of horns adorning his head, the demon looked fearsome and sinister. Gazing down, he lingered for a few moments. Two dark scarlet embers ignited in the depths of the demon's eyes. Shifting his terrifying scythes, the giant monster walked forward, slowly descending from the hill to face the strange visitor. The ground shook as he approached. However, the bizarre Centaurian did not even flinch. In fact, it remained completely motionless. The carapace demon stopped some distance away from the suspicious creature. He observed it, clearly understanding that its pathetic appearance might be a trap. The labyrinth was full of unimaginable dangers. Rashly approaching an unknown foe was not something an awakened demon, who possessed his own form of intelligence, would do. At least that was what the three sleepers had assumed. However, they were wrong. Just a second later, the carapace demon lunged forward. Its scythe flashed through the air, severing the Centaurian's torso in half. The adamantine chitin was cut apart as though it was made of butter. The upper half of the monster's torso flew off, revealing only emptiness inside. On the other side of the ashen barrow, Sonny, who was running up the slope with all his might, cursed under his breath. That was too soon. He thought that they would have more time. Who knew that the carapace demon would turn out to be such a daredevil? He didn't even hesitate before going all out. With Cassie riding piggyback on his back, Sonny gritted his teeth and tried to run even faster. It was time to switch to Plan B. A moment later, the weird Centaurian's carapace came apart, setting the echo that had been hiding underneath it free. Pushing the pieces of chitin away with its powerful pincers, the scavenger rushed toward the towering demon. It was aiming to duck underneath it and hopefully mess up the giant's legs. The first part of Sonny's plan was rather simple. They were going to use the remains of a dead carapace Centurion to disguise the echo, which was much smaller in comparison, as one of the officers of the Carapace Legion. Then they would send it to the base of the ashen barrow to lure the demon away. The three of them were going to circle the hill and hide themselves under the gray sand in advance, then run up the slope and to the center of the island as soon as the demon had left. The echo was supposed to buy them enough time to climb the great tree and conceal themselves in its branches. Then, Sonny would dismiss the echo, thus finishing the first stage of the plan. He never intended for the scavenger to actually fight the fearsome demon. However, the carapace demon's unusually swift act of aggression had messed up the timing of the whole thing. The decoy was already destroyed, yet they weren't even halfway to the tree. In this situation, there was no choice but to order the echo to attack, hoping that it could stall the giant monster. That way, of course, Sonny was putting his scavenger at risk. But there was no other choice. Just as he was about to reach the crest of the hill, the echo tried to hide itself beneath the carapace demon's massive body. It was doing the same thing that Nephi's had done when fighting the first carapace centurion, intending to use the size of the enemy against it. The difference was that this time, the smaller participant of the fight was clad in a sturdy carapace, as opposed to a squishy human girl who had no protection. Even if the demon tried to crush the scavenger with its weight, it wouldn't be able to kill it. However, the demon understood it too. Moving with incredible speed, he shifted his torso and struck out with a pincer. The scavenger was swatted away like an irritating insect, flying through the air and heavily crashing onto the ground. Its carapace had almost cracked. Running toward the great tree, Sonny grimaced. He wanted to dismiss the echo but knew that it was too soon. They needed more time. Ahead of him, Nephi's was already approaching the enormous black trunk. Not wasting any time, she removed the seaweed rucksack from her back, gently laid it on the ground and began climbing, grabbing onto the cracks of the onyx bark. Meanwhile, the echo was shakily rising to its legs. A stubborn light was burning in its eyes. Producing a loud screech, it clacked its pincers in the air and once again rushed toward the demon. "Go get him, buddy," Sonny screamed inwardly, wishing his scavenger luck with all his heart. The smaller creature bravely ran toward the steel behemoth, raising its pincers to attack. It was followed by two shadows, one bestial, the other one human. Sonny was quickly shortening the distance to the great tree. Below the hill, the carapace demon calmly stepped toward the rushing enemy. Its four arms moved in unison. Suddenly, the scavenger's arms were sliced off. Its body was gripped in two giant pincers and raised into the air. Sonny didn't even have time to react. A fraction of a second later, the demon slightly strained its arms and tore the echo in two, separating its torso from the carapace and crushing both halves into a bloody pulp. On top of the hill, Sonny stumbled. The familiar voice resounded like a tolling bell in his ears. "Your echo has been destroyed. Your echo has been destroyed." Sonny stumbled and almost fell. Cassie gripped his shoulders tightly and leaned back a little, trying to help him keep balance. With fallen leaves flying from under his feet, Sonny somehow managed to catch himself in time. No! Anger and regret clouded his mind, but it was too late to do anything. His trusty scavenger was dead, sliced and torn apart by the giant creature. The ease and brutality with which the carapace demon had decimated the poor, brave beast would have been insulting, if it wasn't so terrifying. It only took him a split second. The echo was gone. Not only had Sonny seen its tragic end through the eyes of his shadow, he also felt the subtle connection between them disappear. In his soul sea, one of the spheres of light shimmered and vanished, leaving the silent surface of the water a little bit darker. He had lost his most valuable possession. But the bitterness Sonny felt was not only because of how useful the echo had been, or how much money it could have brought him in the real world. He had actually grown to like the mindless scavenger quite a bit. It was big, loyal, and reliable. It even seemed to possess a strange sort of stubborn, off-putting personality. And now it was dead. Gritting his teeth, Sonny ran like a madman. There would be time to mourn the loss of the loyal echo later. Right now, they had bigger problems. "Sonny, what happened?" Cassie's whisper sounded worried and tense. She must have felt the change in his mood through his posture and body language. To be completely honest, Sonny was in no shape to talk. Running up the hill at top speed, with the blind girl on his back, no matter how delicate and light she was, had been a tall task for him without the support of the shadow. He was struggling to breathe, and there was still a considerable distance to the great tree. However, Sonny had to answer, his voice hoarse and rugged. He killed the echo. Then there was no time for words anymore, because things were turning from bad to worse. Down at the bottom of the hill, the carapace demon was standing above the mutilated remains of the scavenger, looking at them with contempt. Heavy drops of azure blood were falling from each of his 4 upper limbs. Suddenly, the corpse of the echo began to shine with soft light. Then, it shimmered and dissolved into a river of tiny sparks, which then fell to the ground and disappeared, leaving no trace of the hulking scavenger behind. Even its blood on the demon's scythes and pincers was gone. After all, the echo was just a manifestation of a slain nightmare creature, and not the real thing. It came from nothing, and was now returned to the state of nothingness. However, the carapace demon was not looking at the unexpected light show. Instead, he was staring at one particular spot on the ground. There, a lonely human shadow was frozen in confusion, uncertain what to do. With the body of the echo, and consequently, its spacious shadow, gone, it was instantly revealed and had nowhere else to hide. Grab! The demon tilted his head, then moved with the speed of lightning and pierced the shadow with a scythe. Sonny flinched, ready to experience blinding pain. But nothing happened. The shadow, which had raised its hands in fright, looked down at the massive blade protruding from its chest and scratched its head. It was completely fine. Well, of course, it was just a shadow, after all. One had to have a body to be susceptible to such attacks. Right, what else did I think would happen? Meanwhile, the demon was staring at the nonchalant shadow. The menacing scarlet light in his eyes blazed brighter. Sonny was getting closer to the trunk of the tree, temporarily fueled by adrenaline. Otherwise, he might have fainted from the strain already. Just a little more. They had every chance of making it. The shadow just had to distract the giant monster for a bit. But it seemed as though luck was not on his side today. Down below, the carapace demon retrieved his scythe. However, instead of attacking the human shadow again, it suddenly turned around and cast a dark look at the top of the ashen barrow, where the giant tree stood in all its magnificent beauty. The bastard was smart after all. Curse it all. Forgetting about the shadow, the behemoth lunged forward, rushing back up the tall hill's slope. It moved with frightening speed, covering a dozen meters with each second. Get back here, Sonny screamed to his shadow as he approached the trunk of the tree. Helping Cassie climb down from his back, Sonny picked up the rucksack that Nephis had left behind and handed it to the blind girl. Be gentle with that. Cassie nodded, well aware of the contents of the rucksack, and carefully hung it on her shoulder. At that time, Changing Star had already reached the lowest branches of the great tree. Not wasting any time, she moved to a spot above her companions, summoned the golden rope and threw one of its ends down. Catching the rope, Sonny quickly tied a loop and handed it to Cassie. You go up first. The blind girl hesitated for a moment, then accepted it. Just as she was about to put her foot inside the loop, Sonny suddenly stopped her. Wait, summon your staff. The wooden staff that Cassie used to walk was actually a magical item capable of summoning strong winds. In their travels, they rarely had a cause to use it, but now it could come in handy. Surprised and unsure of the reason, she nevertheless did as he had asked, summoning the memory from her sea of soul. The wooden staff appeared in her hand. Sonny lightly hugged the blind girl from behind and turned her body, guiding the hand holding the staff in the necessary direction. Then he said, now summoned the wind. In the next moment, a strong gale rose around them, blasting fallen leaves and ashen sand into the air. Instantly, a large portion of the island's surface was stripped bare. More sand was revealed beneath. Meanwhile, the shadow was racing against the carapace demon. The massive creature was already halfway up the hill, moving with the speed of a rushing train. The nimble shadow, however, was even faster. It had already overtaken the behemoth and was now flying forward, hurrying to return to its master. Good, now go. Sunny helped Cassie put her foot into the loop and stepped back, watching as Nephi's pulled the rope up. She was going as fast as she could, which was really fast by human standards. But was it fast enough? Sweating, he counted seconds and waited. His life now depended on whether or not the rope would return before the demon arrives. Every moment felt like an eternity. He could already hear the distant, but quickly approaching sound of the carapace demon's 8 towering legs stomping furiously through the sand. Finally, Cassie was at the level of the giant tree's lower branches. Nephi's helped her step out of the loop and settle on the wide surface of the branch, then threw the rope down again. The demon was approaching the tree, still hidden from sight by its massive trunk. The shadow slipped beneath Sunny's feet and wrapped itself around his body. Catching the rope, Sunny practically flew up, climbing with incredible, adrenaline-fueled speed. Landing on the branch beside the girls, he quickly turned around and tried to pull the rope up. The monster could not notice the golden shine of it, otherwise, it all would have been for nothing. But there was less than a second left. Oh no, Sunny thought, his heart skipping a beat. But then Nephi simply dismissed the memory, making the golden rope disappear into thin air. The 3 of them crouched, hiding from sight, and held their breaths. A moment later, the furious mass of spikes and polished metal appeared beneath them. The carapace demon abruptly stopped, gazing around with his burning scarlet eyes. His pincers clicked, as if thirsty to tear flesh apart. The terrifying scythes were raised into the air, ready to slash and sever. But there was nothing to kill underneath the great tree. The demon lingered, looking right and left. Then he raised his head and looked up. Thankfully, the branch the 3 sleepers were hiding on was very wide, more than enough to hide them from his sight. They remained motionless and silent, afraid to produce even the smallest of sounds. After a while, the behemoth finally lowered his gaze and carefully observed the ground, looking for the traces of possible intruders. However, the ground was clean and bare, all signs of their passage erased by Sunny with the help of Cassie's staff in advance. Not finding anything, the carapace demon had no choice but to walk away, moving on to explore other parts of the island. Sunny was finally able to exhale. Some distance away, the demon reached the edges of the area affected by the magical gale. There, he finally found 2 sets of footprints, one left behind by Nephi's, the other one by Sunny. With an angry roar that sounded like the clamor of tearing metal, the giant creature rushed down the slope of the ashen barrow, following the footprints to the wasteland beneath. However, the gray desert was desolate and empty, with no living creature in sight. It was colored crimson by the setting sun. At that moment, the ground shook slightly, and a thunderous rumble resounded throughout the labyrinth, bringing with it chilling wind and the smell of salt. The dark sea was returning. Throwing one last hateful gaze toward the wasteland, the carapace demon turned around and slowly headed back to the top of his barrow. Sunny, Nephi's and Cassie sat on a branch of the great tree, waiting for the sun to set. The branch was wide enough to accommodate twice as many people, so they weren't worried about being spotted from the ground. Still, they remained silent and motionless, wary of the giant monster that sometimes appeared beneath their hiding place. The sound of his footsteps sent shivers through the tense bodies of the 3 sleepers. Not once since coming to the forgotten shore had Sunny hoped for the night to come faster, but there was a first time for everything. They could only proceed with the next step of the plan after darkness had fallen, so there was nothing to do now but wait. Sitting with his back against Neff and Cassie, Sonny stared into the distance and tried not to think about anything. Obsessing over past mistakes and future risks was only going to dampen his resolve, and it was already in short supply. Meeting a setback so early into the plan really threw Sonny off his game. He still couldn't recover from the sudden loss of the precious echo. Of course, he knew beforehand that many things could go wrong. In fact, he had even warned the girls that there were too many unpredictable elements, and thus it was impossible to reliably predict their chances of success. Nevertheless, he had not expected to lose the strongest member of their group at the very beginning. The first stage of the plan was supposed to be the safest. Things to come were going to be much more dangerous. Sonny looked at the darkening skis, barely visible through the thick canopy of the great tree's crown, and listened to the noise of the rising sea. In the dim twilight, Cassie shifted a little and then gently squeezed his hand. Her warm touch made Sonny tense up, but then, realizing that the blind girl was just trying to console him, he allowed himself to relax. Stupid, what am I, a kid? Holding hands will not solve anything. But despite these grumbling thoughts, Sonny reluctantly realized that he did feel a bit reassured, with no logical reason at all. Maybe they were going to pull this off after all. If this was their will, who dared to stop them? Soon the night descended, drowning the world in absolute darkness. The Ashen Barrow had become an island in the black, undulating void of the dark sea. The breaks of the great tree swayed gently in the darkness, their vibrant scarlet leaves now indistinguishable from the obsidian surface of the wood. The leaves whispered and rustled, creating a calming melody in the threatening murmur of the surging waves. Sonny sighed, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. He was sure of his plan as far as it was possible to be sure of anything in this cursed place. But he also knew all the risks and all the things that could go wrong. At the end of it all, they were still tossing a coin, hoping that its fall was not going to spell their doom. He felt Neff's position shift. She turned her head and glanced in his direction, a calm expression on her face. Today, her inexplicable ability to remain composed in any situation, no matter how dire, was especially frustrating. Even though Changing Star could not see anything in the pitch-black darkness of the starless void, she knew that he would notice her questioning look. Sonny closed his eyes, then opened them again and slowly exhaled. "Let's begin." The three of them moved, performing a rehearsed set of motions. Cassie carefully shifted to the side, giving Sonny and Nephi space to do what needed to be done. Sonny gently placed the seaweed rucksack between himself and Neff, then opened it. His motions were slow and cautious. Inside the rucksack, two large clay containers lay surrounded by several layers of soft seaweed fiber. These jars were made by Sonny himself, and as such were not particularly sturdy. After all, he wasn't a craftsman. All his knowledge about pottery was received in a single day of listening to teacher Julius's rants about the importance of clay in the development of human civilization. Still, he at least remembered the basics. Inside the jars, all the oil they had gathered from the centipede monsters splashed around, making Sonny's heartbeat unsteady. A centipede monster had 2 sacs in its body, each containing a different oily substance. When mixed, these substances produced an incredibly corrosive, deadly oil that could eat through a scavenger's carapace in seconds. It was also highly flammable. The jars contained the 2 components of the centipede oil. If they were to break during their run to the great tree, allowing the components to mix, well, there was a reason why the rucksack was entrusted to Nephi's, while Sonny carried Cassie despite his inferior physical endurance. The centipede oil was the centerpiece of his plan. Placing the clay jars on the branch, Sonny took out one last thing from the rucksack. It was a makeshift torch made out of bone and, more seaweed. Traditionally, torches were supposed to be made out of wood, but on the Forbidden Shore, bones were much more easily found than sticks. In the darkness, he found Neff's cool hand, took it into his own, and then placed the torch on her open palm. At that moment, Sonny couldn't help but remember the other times Changing Star's hands had touched his body. The first time was when he was dying, his chest crushed by the Carapace Centurion's bone scythe. The other time was on the day he handed her the Starlight Legion armor and learned about her cruel flaw. Both days were very memorable, although for different reasons. He had a feeling that this day was also going to be forever etched in his memory, provided they lived to see the morning. Sonny deeply inhaled. "I'm ready." Nephi's nodded and then rose to her feet. Standing tall, she grasped the torch and closed her eyes as though praying. Clad in white armor with her silver hair dancing in the wind, she looked like a beautiful, solemn angel. Then white radiance ignited beneath her eyelids. In the next moment, bright fire burst from beneath her hands, igniting the top of the torch. Changing Star opened her eyes, extinguishing the light shining in them, and raised the torch high above her head. In the lightless world, this single small flame looked like a lonely star drowning in the sea of darkness. Simultaneously, Sonny stepped to the edge of the branch, inhaled deeply, and screamed at the top of his lungs. "Hey, asshole, come get me if you dare." Then all hell broke loose. Attracted by the sudden burst of light and Sonny's belligerent cries, the Carapace demon appeared out of nowhere in a storm of fury. Its towering legs tore through the ashen sand, throwing clouds of it into the air. Two scarlet eyes immediately focused on the shouting human, sending a nervous shiver through Sonny's legs. "Yeah, right here, you pile of scrap. Come and get it, fat lobster. This is my island now," he shouted, pretending to not be scared out of his wits. The demon dashed toward him. This behemoth was as tall as a house, but still not tall enough to reach the branches of the great tree with his scythes. So, for the moment, Sonny was still safe. He was pretty sure that this won't be the case for long, but it was enough time to bring the plan to fruition. If he doesn't miss. Just as the Carapace demon was about to appear right beneath the branch Sonny was standing on, he took a deep breath, aimed, and tossed both of the jars down. The creature reacted with lightning speed, slicing both jars into pieces with his horrible scythes. However, it was of no use. The oily liquids contained inside still rained on its carapace in a torrent, followed by a scattering of clay shards. If anything, it only made the surface of the impact larger, covering most of the demon's metal carapace in a layer of liquid. The two components mixed, producing the deadly corrosive oil, which then burned into the lustrous armor. Sonny held his breath. However, the centipede monster's oil, which was capable of destroying the unbreakable chitin of both scavengers and centurions, turned out to be completely ineffective against the strange alloy covering the Carapace demon's body. It didn't even leave a scratch on it. Sonny's face darkened. "That's..." Nephi silently appeared by his side, raising an arm. "Just as I expected." Luckily, Sonny did not put a lot of value on the oil's corrosive qualities, to begin with. He needed the oil for its other quality, its flammability. Guided by the loud sounds produced by the massive monster, Nephi's moved and threw the torch down with a powerful swing of her arm. Spinning, the torch streaked through the air like a meteor and landed right in the middle of the demon's carapace. In the next second, the giant creature was engulfed in flames. Sonny did not really expect the fire to be able to damage the demon. He was sure that the behemoth could withstand much more than just simple heat. But now, covered in the burning oil, the Carapace demon shined brightly in the pitch-black night of the Forgotten Shore. He had turned into a fiery beacon, calling all the monsters of the cursed dark sea to come crawling from its black depths. The giant demon was engulfed in flames, shining like a bright beacon in the hungry darkness of the night. His polished armor blazed with reflected light, sending radiant glints in all directions. Drops of burning oil were falling to the ground, flaring up as they hit the ashen sand. For a second, it seemed as though time had stopped. Sonny was staring at the incandescent glow of the fire, his eyes wide, almost failing to believe that they had actually pulled this insanity off. Nephi's was frozen by his side, her hand still outstretched after the throw. But they really did. They pulled it off. Sonny never seriously considered facing the carapace demon in an honest battle. If a battle between a giant death machine and 3 powerless humans could even be called honest. However, their lacking strength did not mean that they could not murder the evil creature. They just had to be smart about how to do it. For example, they could find something stronger to do the dirty work for them. That's why he had concocted a plan to sneak onto the ashen barrow, wait for the night to come, light the behemoth aflame, and watch it be torn apart by the terrifying monsters of the dark sea. And now they were halfway to making that plan a reality. Of course, the most dangerous part was yet to come. They still had to survive the attack of the creatures of the black water themselves. And before that, the carapace demon roared with fury, making Sonny feel like his ears were going to bleed. The roar sounded like a deafening cacophony of rusted metal being torn apart by giant claws. 2 scarlet eyes shone through the conflagration of flames, piercing the young man with a concentrated beam of murderous hatred. Before that, they had to last until the sea monsters arrive. The infuriated demon was out for their blood, and no one knew how much time it would take for the dark sea creatures to appear on the ashen barrow. Sonny was scared that the demon was capable of performing ranged attacks. If not, he might be able to climb the tree to get to them, or try to kill them in a way that they had not even considered. In the worst-case scenario, they would have to endure his rage for quite a while. Looking into the giant's hateful eyes, he sensed that the creature was thinking in the same direction. When the demon glanced in the direction of the great tree's obsidian trunk, Sonny's heart suddenly skipped a bit. However, in the end, cold rationality won over seething rage in the carapace demon's mind. Instead of wasting time trying to get to the 3 tiny humans, he suddenly rolled on the ground, hopping to use the sand to douse the flames dancing on his carapace. The whole island shook, almost throwing Sonny off the branch. Crap! Why did the bastard have to be so smart? For a moment, Sonny entertained the idea that the demon was actually going to succeed in extinguishing the fire before the dwellers of the depths had noticed it. But he didn't have to worry. Suddenly, Nephi's turned to face the dark surface of the sea. Her face paled slightly. Sonny was a second late to react, but almost instantly he too felt a strange change in the world around them. It was hard to describe with words. The rustle of the scarlet leaves suddenly felt quieter, the sound of the waves crashing against the shores of the ashen island louder. It was as though some invisible pressure descended on the world, making everything feel slightly different. Then the air became colder, and a wall of thick fog appeared above the dark waters. The carapace demon had also noticed this change. He stopped trying to douse the flames and rose from the sand, the oil still burning on his carapace. Not paying it any attention anymore, the demon turned to the sea, a sense of grim resignation radiating from his posture. Then it was replaced by dark resolve and frenzied bloodlust. The fog slowly moved, crawling onto the island. Sonny felt shivers run down his spine, realizing that it was flowing against the wind. The sound of waves was now muffled and changed, almost imperceptibly so. And there in the fog something was moving. He could almost make out a figure. It was. Suddenly, Cassie's small palm covered his eyes. With her voice trembling with tension, she whispered, "Don't look. No matter what happens, don't open your eyes." Sonny froze, obediently shutting his eyes. A cold sense of fright wrapped itself around his heart. He had never heard the blind girl's voice sound like this before, not even when she was recalling her terrifying visions. Cassie slowly removed her hand. Blinded, he could only rely on his hearing. At least that was what he thought until the cold fog touched his skin. Then, in the muffled silence, he heard Cassie's voice again. Only this time, it was distorted and coming from the wrong direction. "Don't look, don't look, don't look." Sonny gulped, feeling his hair stand on end. The sound of the blind girl's distorted voice echoed in the fog, surrounding him from all sides. Instead of growing quieter, it was becoming louder, overlapping over itself. "Don't look, don't look, don't look, don't look." Then it grew even louder still and turned into a cacophony of screams, crashing into Sonny like a wave, sounding nothing like what human vocal cords could ever produce. "Don't look, don't look, don't look, don't." Sonny stood paralyzed, stunned by the onslaught of inhuman shrieks. All he could do was try not to fall to his knees. And then, when his resilience was almost broken, everything suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence enveloped the world, making him exhale with relief. It was over. A few seconds later, Cassie whispered into his ear, "Open your eyes." After hearing the clear sound of her voice, Sonny was about to do as she told. Then he stopped. Her voice did not sound terrifying and distorted. It was just as usual, sweet and melodic. It even came from the right direction. But something about it was wrong. What? He lingered, keeping his eyes closed. Why was it so calm? Why didn't he feel the warmth of her breath as she leaned close to whisper into his ear? And how could she lean if he was taller? Sonny froze, afraid to even breathe. Cassie's clear, familiar voice repeated, "Open your eyes, open." Then, mere centimeters away, it exploded with cold, malevolent authority. "Open your eyes." But he didn't. A second passed, then another, then one more. Each of them felt like an eternity. Sonny trembled, practically feeling his body aging. Finally, the voice returned. But this time it felt as though it was further away, withdrawing. No matter, no matter. Soon, he was able to hear the rustling of leaves and the sound of waves again. He could also hear Cassie and Neff breathing ruggedly beside him. It seemed that they were also assaulted by the terrifying mimic. And also, somewhere beneath them, the carapace demon roared and hit his scythes against each other. The loud clamor of steel resounded beneath the great tree, sending an almost palpable wave in all directions. This wave seemed to expel the unnatural fog, creating an enormous sphere of clean air. Sonny still kept his eyes shut. In the next moment, the whole island trembled as the demon clashed with the unknown horror that had been hiding in the fog. Something shattered with a deafening thunder, and the ground shook again, causing the branches of the great tree to sway. With his hands trembling, Sonny outstretched them and grabbed onto his companions, drawing them close. Holding each other, they listened to the sounds of the furious battle and waited. An eternity later, the fight between the carapace demon and the guest from the depths was over. Silence had returned to the Ashen Barrow once again. Sonny had long ago lost the track of time and grew desensitized to the tremors running through the great tree each time the two monsters clashed. Sudden stillness gave him a start. With a slight shudder, he turned his head and listened, trying to discern what was happening. In the quiet aftermath of the terrible battle, Nephis hesitated and then said in a raspy voice, "We can open our eyes now." Sonny lingered before following her advice. He opened his eyes and blinked a couple of times, his vision slowly returning. The pale light of dawn was creeping from the east, enveloping the island in the dim twilight. Beneath them, the surface of the island was torn apart and upturned, almost unrecognizable. It was as though the Ashen Barrow was pummeled by several rounds of heavy artillery fire. And on that surface, damn it! The carapace demon was slowly limping back from the edges of the island, leaving a trail of azure blood behind. He was heavily wounded and in a terrible shape, with several limbs missing and a spiderweb of cracks covering his once pristine carapace. Two of his arms were gone, leaving him with a single scythe and a single pincer. Most of his rear legs were either broken or severed, forcing the behemoth to walk in a strange, unsteady gait. However, he was still alive. More than that, none of the armor plates covering his vital organs were seriously damaged, his metal shell still strong and impenetrable. Sonny clenched his fists and glanced at Neff, a dark expression on his face. What do we do?" Changing Star looked down. There was a cold glint in her calm, gray eyes. Stretching her arm to the side, she summoned her sword and said, "Finish him off." Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story, and if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be SUPRISC for all of you. Stay tuned.